just, okay. Okay, yeah, mute. Okay. I think we probably could get started now. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our series on confronting racism, discrimination, and othering, perspectives from around the globe. I'm Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Alanson White Institute of Psychiatry, Psychoanalysis, and Psychology. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I would like to thank members of our administration who support our series: Kenneth Isold, Elizabeth Krimendahl, Richard Herman, John Aumann, and Elizabeth Rodman. I would also like to thank the members of my committee who invite our speakers and are our moderators. They have created our program as well. My committees include Karen Gennaro, Anton Hart, Tom Hennis, Gurmeet Kanwal, Vladan Novokovich, Hopton Shaw, David Solomon, and Cleone White. To all of you, thank you. I would like to extend a special welcome to our attendees from around the globe. Regarding questions for our speakers, thank you for those who submitted questions in advance via email. If you have not submitted a question yet and you would like to during our webinar, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please put your question in there. Thank you. Our speaker today is Professor Laura T. Murphy. She is joining us from Oxford, England. She is a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at the Helena Kennedy Center at Sheffield Hallam University. She has been the recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, a British Academy Visiting Fellow, and the John G. Medlin Fellow at the National Humanities Center. Professor Murphy is the author of The New Slave Narrative, The Battle Over Representations of Contemporary Slavery. She is the editor of Survivors of Slavery, Modern Slave Narratives, and author of Metaphor and the Slave Trade in West African Literature. Her most recent book, Freedomville, The Story of the 21st Slave Revolt. Professor Murphy's research is broadly interested in forced labor globally, with particular interest in survivor narratives and first-person testimony. She is currently working on several research projects about the Chinese government's intertwined systems of internment and forced labor that have been inflicted on the people of the Uyghur region. The work investigates the international supply chains that have ties to those repressive systems. She has previously conducted research on forced labor in India, Nigeria, Ghana, the United States, and Canada. She has consulted for the World Health Organization, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Office of Victims of Crime, and the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. She serves as a subject matter expert in the field of human trafficking for the U.S. Office of Victims of Crime and the Administration of Children and Family. So welcome, Dr. Murphy. We're very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our moderator today is Professor Nicole Alexander Floyd, a professor of political science at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, a lawyer and political scientist, an author, and a featured speaker at colleges and universities around the country. Dr. Alexander Floyd has been actively engaged in a range of political and legal issues, advocating for minorities and especially for women of color. She co-founded the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics, an organization promoting research on Black women in politics that is committed to recruiting and mentoring women of African descent in political science. As a legal theorist and activist, she has worked on some of the cutting-edge legal cases of our time, including the important Hopwood case in Texas, leading to her appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show and on National Public Radio. An award-winning educator, she teaches a range of courses on Black feminist theory, Black women's political activism, race, Gender, Media, and the Law. Dr. Alexandra Floyd is the author of Gender, Race, and Nationalism in Contemporary Black Politics, and her articles have appeared in numerous leading journals. So that's enough from me. Welcome to both of you, and I will leave now the program to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria. And thank you so much for all of you who have joined us this morning for this important discussion. And so I want to just get right into it because I know that we have lots of questions. Laura, we are just delighted to have you here. I wanted to just point out for the audience that I was pleased to learn that Laura is actually from my home state of Louisiana.
That's right.
And that brings me great delight. So the first I guess question that that comes to mind, of course, is what brought you to this area of research. I know that you have very wide range of issues that you've investigated. You have a really solid and strong background and training and education in literature, right?
Yeah.
And also your PhD is in African American and African studies. And so this is really you've obviously had a very interesting journey to come to this point. So tell us more about that. How did you come to study, this particular issue?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. Thank you, Nicole and Maria, both for having me and for engaging in this conversation and for, getting some conversation going about this book. I really appreciate it. I'm from Louisiana, and that's central to the story of how I ended up doing the work I do. I often tell my students in particular, but I often tell the story that, when I was a young person growing up in Louisiana, there were only a couple of ways you learned as a white woman in a sort of rural town that was, it was a diverse town. But, we learned about slavery in a couple of different ways. One was by going to plantations where they told the story of the great family who was rich, the white family that owned this house. And the narrative basically stopped there. That's changing in the last 10 years or so. But certainly when I was a child, we were taken on our school field trips, went to plantations. And I'm sure you probably had the same thing, Nicole.
Actually, no, we didn't take trips to plantations. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
We did every year. And the story was always a story of about the people who owned the house and, what a luxurious life they had until the scary war came and took everything away from them and wrecked Louisiana's economy, right? Just outrageous. And then there was also, you got taught in school about the abolitionist movement and about the end of slavery. And I guess, I had this mistaken assumption as a young person that I somehow would have transcended this system, this culture of whiteness and white supremacy, and that I would have somehow, my parents, I was a teenager. Surely my parents would be bad guys and I would be kicking down doors and helping people. And we were taught the narrative of slavery as a sort of rescue narrative too, that white people were the abolitionists. And these stories sort of pervaded my youth and my understanding of slavery. But at some point, when I was in school, I started reading African literature and I started learning more about slavery. And I just thought it was critical for me to know more as a person, as a white person from the South, to know more about slavery. But then in the midst of doing that research, I learned that there were people who were forced to work without pay all over the world still today, and who were not able to walk away from the work that they were doing, that they were held either by debts or held by violence, often held by violence, sometimes still held by transgenerational structures of ownership even, although that's much less common today. And I thought, growing up, I thought that I would have been somebody who would have opposed slavery. I would have been somebody who had done something to ensure that our economy was not grounded in forced labor. And I thought, okay, this thing that I have to do. I somehow felt a moral obligation to shift my entire career to understanding better how forced labor continues to exist in our midst, how people respond to it, and how people get out of it. And doing that work, it led me to the story of Freedomville. And it also led me to understand even more that this is not a story of rescue, it's a story of agency, and this was something, of course, I was learning before, but these narratives, I think, the working with people who are survivors of a multiple different forms of slavery today have taught me more and more that, folks are finding innovating ways to break the bounds of forced labor, and that it's actually our society, it's the systemic problems that we create and maintain, and the systemic inequalities that we maintain as a society that make slavery and forced labor possible. And it's on us to bring those barriers down so that people don't have to do that. So they don't become enslaved in the first place, and also so that their escape is if they do end up in a situation like that, is enabled. So that's the kind of work I've been doing since then.
So thank you for that background. I'm a labor activist, so I'm always excited to see the kind of ways in which people are pushing back against the ways in which they are exploited. As I read Freedomville, I just want to show the audience here. That looks like it's a accessible book, and something that people can definitely get into. I was struck, and I do want you to, of course, talk a bit more about the specifics of what you examine here. But reading this, the Azad Nagar people, right? This place, what you call Freedomville, or we call this Freedom Town. You talk about that as a kind of a closer translation of it. This actually struck me to be more in line with sharecropping or tenant farming, as opposed to slavery, at least in terms of how we understand in terms of the Atlantic slave trade. And so why this particular frame? What are the advantages and disadvantages of actually using this particular framework?
Yeah, you mean the framework of slavery in particular? Yeah, thanks for asking that. In this case, the people themselves identify the experience they had as slavery. A lot of the work I do sort of grows out of the language of the people who I'm, writing about. So if people call it forced labor, I call it forced labor. If people call it slavery, I call it slavery. In this case, it's technically what the people of Ajadnagar were experiencing was what's technically called debt bondage. They were people who had taken out a debt and who were told essentially, and they were illiterate and innumerate people, so they didn't calculate the interest. They didn't know how much. They weren't keeping a ledger of what they owed, but they had a situation where, despite the fact that ostensibly they would get out of the work arrangement that was supposed to repay their debt, these families never let them out of the debt. And in this case, you might have a situation, you might think of it as indentured laborers, people who, like in the 19th century or the 18th century would have come to the United States on a 7-year contract, owing a debt or something like that. That is the case in some cases of debt bondage. In other cases like this, the same family had held these folks in debt bondage for generations. So these folks' parents had been in bondage. Their parents had been in bondage for generations. The people of Ajadnagar had been enslaved to the same exact families, and they had no idea that escape was possible. They had no sense that they had a right. In fact, they believed that if they were to try to walk away, they would be the ones who were committing a criminal act. Of course, it's illegal to hold people in bondage like this in India, at least since 1947 it is. And so they were in a situation that was a system of transgenerational bondage that was inescapable, that was totally confirmed by the culture that they lived in, by the society they lived in. People accepted it and understood it to be sort of a natural part of the division between their caste and the caste that was holding them in this bondage. And so in that way, it has a lot of resonance with the sort of 19th century model of enslavement of people of African descent. But one of the things I like to remind folks is that slavery has taken on many, many forms over millennia, right? And so the shape of slavery has changed over time. And while surely like one of the most extraordinarily gruesome versions of slavery happened in the Americas in the 19th century to people of African descent, there have been situations of slavery that have happened in Africa, for instance, where people were allowed to own land, own their own, own people, and some have even become royalty or leaders there, and that's happened since the era of the Greeks and the Romans as well. So slavery has changed, and I think that in America we've kind of locked it into a single experience. But I think it's important that we use the word slavery to mean labor that is forced against people's will, without pay, typically under threat of violence, without the means to escape, as a way of eliciting the gravity of those situations. I don't believe in using it metaphorically. Mm-hmm. I don't like it when people say my teacher is a slave driver. I got no time for that. I don't like it when advocates in the anti-trafficking movement act like all people who are engaged in the sex trade are slaves. I mean, this is just outrageous. And I think that kind of misuse of the word is offensive. But I do think that we can use this word with precision to describe things that are happening around the world that don't have the exact same contours as the as 19th century African American enslavement, but that share many of the same characteristics that are really, really what is the most characteristic of slavery across time and across geography.
Well, one of the things that just to push back a little, when people think about the word slavery, they typically don't associate it in this particular kind of definitely in the Western context in this historical moment with slavery in Greece, right? And most of the parallels or associations you use throughout the book, you start off with Harriet Tubman, referencing also Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, those kind of figures that people associate with slavery here in the U.S. I really am, interested in talking about, especially the ways in which, people in this, context were agentic and pushed back against the ways in which, their lives were being constrained, in this situation.
Yeah. So the people of Ajadnagar for generations had understood their experience to be, stuck, that they had no exit strategy. They didn't have an opportunity to leave. They lived in the same community as the people who held them in bondage. They were surrounded by a society that said that was their place as Adivasis. They were indigenous people, the word they use for their for indigeneity is Adivasi. And so they understood it as their place. But then there started to be some on the ground grassroots organizations who came around and started talking to them and saying, this is illegal. You don't have to live like this. And they were quite afraid of what the consequences would be, because the situation of enslavement that they were living in was extremely brutal. There were people who were, set people's houses on fire, murdered the Adivasi people. There were some people who were raping the young women who were among the Adivasis. They basically treated them as if they were, and some people said that they were treated as animals. And so they were terrified that if they were to resist, that would, every time they had resisted, that was the consequence, was violence. But a ton of communities got together and said, okay, we're going to do this together. And there became this unusual opportunity where grassroots organizations were helping them, the Adivasi people, get leases to their own land. They had been working in rock quarries, and this opportunity to get a lease to their own rock quarry where they could continue the work they knew how to do, but also be agents in the market themselves, be able to sell the products, take back the means of production, essentially, was an opportunity that they didn't have before. I think a lot of people, even those who believe that they have the right to freedom, believe that they want to escape the situation, they're prevented from doing it because no matter where they are, they won't have a place to sleep at night. They won't have any way to make any money. Their children will starve, and they're terrified of the consequences of leaving. This opportunity for a lease gave them a sense of hope that they would have something for their own to be able to turn to if they left the people who had been forcing them to work for these generations. And that's what turned the tide.
It was really amazing to I know that you're drawing on, a rich body of historical, data in kind of bringing this story to life, to see people selling whatever it is that they had, right? Yeah. Their animals, their whatever possessions coming together, that it was just a very powerful kind of image. And to think too about, like the trickster figure you talk about, right? Who Kanshuki, who was able to circulate, right? And live among people, right? And to be able to do organizing and develop and a kind of radical consciousness, promote a radical consciousness in that context. He was became a beloved figure in the community. Also Amar, the party that was working. What do you see are the kind of major lessons to be learned from those different levels of scale in terms of engagement?
Yeah, thanks. I think that what really matters, what it comes down to is that the Adivasis, led their own revolt, gathered together, created a group consciousness, as you said. They created a platform. They were going to run their own candidate. That is really what matters. But at the same time, they were assisted by people who were essentially caste traders, like Kanshuki. Kanshuki didn't want to hang out with other people he was in a caste above theirs, and he shed all of his possessions and went and lived among the Adivasi people and slept, stayed and worked with them and stayed in their house at night. And he, helped them to understand that they had rights and then got out of their way when they were ready to do what they to overthrow the system that they were living in. But that multi-caste coalition of people who were willing to assist them in what they needed afterwards was critical for their survival after they got free, because they needed somebody who could go. They weren't listened to for generations. They had been saying, and these folks had been going to the legislature and going to agencies, the official channels that they're supposed to use to ask for their rights, to ask for land. They had tried that, and they had been ignored and derided. And when they went to the police to make claims against, the people who were landowners who were raping and hurting them, they were just sent away. They were ignored. And so what these other folks did was use their privilege to have access to the police, to have access to the courts and to the land holding offices, so that they could use those platforms to assist the Adivasis in doing what they needed to do once they had decided this is where they were headed. And I think that's an important lesson. I think they would have done it on their own, but it would have been harder for them to navigate the aftermath, I think, without land, without rights, and without the police, without any assistance.
Right. So you talk about how the freedom that they sought and secured was in many ways a precarious freedom. And the kind of framing of the narratives around the quote unquote revolt, right, in this historical context, had a particular frame that, in your view, needs to be adjusted, right, in terms of thinking about nonviolent action, violence as a response to political repression. How did you tell us more about how you came to that particular perspective?
Yeah. So for a long time, I had learned about the people of Ajad Nagar or Freedomville, and I had read about them in a couple of nonprofit campaigns. There was a short documentary made about their lives and about their freedom in particular that really celebrated.
documentary over and over and over again, right?
What's that?
You said you watched that documentary, like almost obsessively, right?
I did. And I made a collection of narratives of people who had been, enslaved or forced laborers. And I had listened to their recordings of their interviews with a nonprofit group and transcribed them myself. So I knew their voices. I'd seen their videos. I knew their faces. I'd been teaching about them. I had transcribed all these things and published their narratives.
Out of curiosity, what were the transcriptions? What language were those transcriptions in?
So they were speaking Hindi, and then there was a simultaneous translator, and then we had another translator go back and check the translations. And but I hadn't met them myself. And I went back in 2014. I happened to have an opportunity to go to India. And I said, okay, if I'm going to go, I'd like to go see how, now 14 years later, the people of Ajnagar are getting along. How is this working for them? I knew that they were trying to run for office. They were trying to have political power. What was that like? And when I got there, they said, things are terrible. We've been cut off. All our neighbors have electricity, but we don't. All of our neighbors have gotten, this or that. They've got leases, or they've got, better school clothes for their kids, or they've got, bathrooms was a big deal at the time. They were having latrines installed in their area, but they had been cut off. And I was, listening, I was asking them why, and they started to tell me a story that was different from the story I had heard in those transcriptions, different from the stories that people had told who had talked to them before. And that was that they had intentionally murdered one of the people who had been the landholders, that one of the most brutal guys who had been treating them the worst, and had maimed several other of the guys in the community. And they had this big rally to, rally their spirits and help them, get their land, but they had gone knowing that they would probably be attacked for gathering. And they went knowing that they were going to fight back. They carried with them the very hammers that they used to break the rocks in the quarries, with the intent of breaking the heads of the people who had been holding them in slavery for generations. And this was a surprise to me, not because I find it surprising that people would react that way, but because I've been hearing their stories, for 14 years. And suddenly, for 10 at that point for me, suddenly the story was different. And it turned out they had in fact intentionally murdered this one guy. And what had happened as a result of the fact that they had to some extent been quiet about that murder, but also the nonprofits that were telling their story had no interest in selling the story of a violent revolution. What they wanted to say was, these folks fought back in broad and vague terms, and they managed to get the land to the lease, and they managed to win their freedom, and now their children are happy, and now they're all healthy. But then the nonprofits had disappeared, and they didn't go back to see how they were doing anymore. And they were in a lot of trouble because they were being cut off because of the murder. And so they were getting excluded from whatever entitlements they were supposed to have because of this particular violent response. And so a couple of the takeaways I came away with was one, there needs to be sustained support for groups for people who come out of situations of exploitation, no matter what. We need to have systems of sustained support. We need to have a sense of long-term care and collaboration that exists beyond just the moment of emancipation, if that's what's going on. And that they have been failed in part because that support needs to address the way they emancipated themselves. It needs to be honest and clear and real about what the repercussions of that are. And no one had really taken into account that these folks who had used violent means to revolt would have a different outcome than people that use nonviolent means. But part of the reason that is, and this is one of the big things that I want to emphasize in the book, is that part of the reason for that is that in the West, in the US, there's a whole fetishization of nonviolent protest that says that there's no excuse for violence. Well, there is. I mean, these folks have been murdered and raped and abused and exploited for generations, and we expect them to just keep trying to use official channels to air their grievances when we know that those official channels have failed them generation after generation after generation. Every time they go, they're failed through official channels. And then when people do say, okay, we're going to retaliate with violence, I think that culturally the response is that's irrational, right? And that's not the case. This is a reasoned response to violence that has been enacted on them time and time again. And when we do that, when we act as if their violence is irrational, we cede, like we accept the idea that the state and also rich elite actors have the right to violence, and poor and marginalized people do not have a right to violence. That the state's violence is logical somehow, that it's rational, but the marginalized people's violence is irrational, and I don't think we should fall for that.
And and obviously it's some convenient amnesia, right? Willful ignorance, because our country, the United States, was founded through revolution, right?
That's right. And we call those folks patriots, right?
Yeah,
without question.
Without question. But I mean, it's a really tricky and complicated point, right? Because people are trying to get support from wherever they can, kind of domestically, internationally, and obviously, it's more palatable, right, to have the idea of supporting nonviolent social change. Of course, part of what scholars in India have also long talked about, how activities or political efforts that are billed as nonviolent actually surround and include a range of different types of tactics. And so
that's right.
One of the things that's really kind of difficult and I think important to tease out are the ways in which the efforts to assist at times can actually also, as you said, undermine local communities, because these things don't actually come with ideas of long-term support, long-term investment, and at the same time, it does undermine the capacity and the context for people to continue to work within their given context, because critiques of transnational politics in general, especially not just transnational feminist politics, but in general, that it doesn't recognize that people still operate in nation states. And what's happening, how do we undermine or support? How do we support people's capacity to continue to make change, where they are? And it resonates in so many different ways, because sometimes we work with, what's been called the kind of the myth of rights, right? We think that once a right is something that we secure, then people will automatically fall in line.
That's right.
But history shows us that that's not the case. The politics of rights, as Stuart Sheingold talks about, right? It's important that their articulation is important. They bear the imprint, of the state and the support of that, but they're more correctly seen as tools in terms of making ongoing social change. So I wanted to ask one of the kind of questions that we're interested in thinking through in terms of trauma and oppression and how it impacts people from one generation to another. So if you can speak to that, in this kind of cultural context that you're studying in this work, but also from the oppressed and the oppressor. So maybe we can kind of get into that, and I'm kind of mindful of our time. I know we probably have questions from the audience too, but I think that's a really key point we'd like to get your perspective on.
Yeah, the people of Ajadnagar, had long believed that they were inherently inferior. And that was part of that transgenerational trauma, I think, that they had been told for so long and been treated as inferior that they had come to sort of internalize that. And their fear in fact, their fear of freedom itself was a condition, a cultural context that was, instilled in them that they were not capable of freedom, that they were somehow children. I mean, these are tropes that happen in 19th century slavery as well, of course, that they needed the people who were the landholders to take care of them. And in some ways, for some of those Adivasi people, they had internalized this idea, and that was part of the trauma of this work. But also they were, there are a lot of different ways that they were struggling. They were disproportionately affected by disease. They were less likely to have for their children to go to school, and that all of this compounds into a situation where their inequality seemed intractable. But the trauma for the people who were the landholders, who were the people who held them in bondage, and
the caste is central, obviously, in this context, right? The landholders.
Say that again. Sorry.
The importance of caste.
Caste, absolutely. Yeah.
The landholders are a different caste, higher caste. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I don't know if I don't think trauma is exactly the right word for their situation, but they had culturally constructed notions of their superiority because of their caste and because of the little bit of land they held. These weren't folks that any of us would identify as being wealthy. They weren't living in plantations for sure, but they certainly had a high degree of mobility and wealth that the Adivasi people didn't have, and access to their rights. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, but they believed that they had this paternalistic myth that they were helping the people. And this is a kind of, a lot of 19th century African-American scholars will talk about this as well, that there's a kind of, the slave narrators talk about it as well, about the just pathology of white supremacy and the pathology of slave ownership. And that the power that they wielded when suddenly these folks, the Adivasi people, were emancipated, it came as a total shock to the system. They were completely mortified. They thought that the relationship had broken, and that why in the world would the Adivasi people even want this? We had such a good relationship, and now it's destroyed. And I wouldn't call that trauma exactly. But they were really surprised. Their psychological foundations were shaken. What they understood about how the world worked and the order of the world was completely undone. So maybe it is a kind of trauma, right? I just don't feel as much sympathy for it. But they had those same kinds of ideas of paternalism that we read about from the 19th century, and were still trying to work their way through it and operate in a society that had really changed quite quickly.
Yeah. No, and I think pathology is inappropriate term. Also, the association that I got was kind of deformation, right? Kind of deformation of one's sense of self, a sense of morality, and I was also put in mind of Nell Painter's work on psychology, and the psychology, thinking about how slavery continues to be impactful in terms of not only in the U.S. African-American psychology, but to think, how has that impacted white psychology? What are the ways in which we continue to glorify violence? What are the ways in which ideas about kind of sadomasochistic relations, power relations in workplaces, in industries continue to bear that imprint? And I was reminded, as I was engaging your text, of a conversation that I had with also with a British barrister decades ago, and we were talking about differences in around race and also colonialism and what have you. And she says, this is where it all began. She said, in England, right?
Yeah.
that, it's interesting, given your social location, your background, that you are situated in England. But, some people, Stacey Patton comes to mind, but others have talked about the kind of cultural impact and the legacy of violence, whether it be through raising the children, through punishment, that actually set the stage for chattel slavery in the United States. So that question of inheritance, I think, is important to think about, whether you would call it trauma, deprivation, pathology, etc. But sometimes when we talk about that issues of transgenerational transmission, we only focus on people of color. We don't talk about what that means for white psychology. So what aspect of the kind of because this kind of international movement that you're part of to deal with different types of forced labor, what about the questions of reparations, right? As a practical matter, reparations for formerly colonized nations, for the people of Azar Nagur. I mean, how does that play into the kind of calculus of what's happening in terms of the political response?
Yeah, just to take a step back for a second, I'm very influenced by Saidiya Hartman's work, for instance. And of course, I have training in African and African American studies. And so a lot of the lenses through which I'm seeing this, this story, this situation, this experience is through those same narratives. I think a lot about Harriet Jacobs and the perverse sneaking around of what is his name, Mr. Norcom. It's been a while since I've read Harriet Jacobs, but Mr. Norcom, I think it is, who's the guy who owns the plantation and who's like creeping in her room and whispering in her ear, and it's like a total madman, and it's like completely perverse. Right. And his wife is the one whispering. That's right. His wife. And so yes. I mean, just like pathological white crazy. And like, I think about that a lot. And when I was sitting there talking to these folks in Ajadnagar, who were people who had been for generations, the ones in power, and were seeing some tiny modicum of that slip away, I couldn't help but think of that those moments there, but also moments in the US and currently where, white men are suddenly so anxious about that losing a tiny bit of power as if it's a zero-sum game. It's really this is playing out in a lot of places. And so I think your question of reparations is appropriate there. And I believe in like a radical redistribution of wealth. I believe in reparations. I think that the wealth that has been made by corporations and states has been made like obviously on the backs of the most marginalized people, and those people remain the most marginalized today, regardless of how much wealth may be accumulated. I have zero patience for that. I actually personally redistribute my own wealth voluntarily, but I don't think I don't even think I get taxed enough. I should be asked to redistribute my wealth all the time, and we have companies that pay $0 in taxes, right? And so like we're so far from reparations that we can allow that to happen. And I think that, in the case of Ajadnagar, they're hardly even getting, to open bank accounts or get electricity to their houses. But we need a radical rethinking of how we understand, inequality, and it can't just be this kind of slow trickle down economics, like it'll all boats will rise if Mark Zuckerberg makes his money. They spend that money going to space and don't care at all, right, about the rest of us, because they're going to leave it leave everybody else behind. Colonized space now. That's right. I was just in a panel about the divvying up of space. It is terrifying. And so I think that we have to have a serious conversation about reparations, and that conversation in many ways should be coming from white people who are like, okay, how are we gonna split up this privilege and wealth that we've accumulated? And I don't see that I don't see that happening. I don't hear people talking about that. You know, in like, you know, if you're sitting around with a bunch of white people, that's not what's coming up. I'll tell you that.
It's not top of
I will
mind.
tell you that. No. Instead, more likely, if I get on a plane and I sit down next to a white person, I say what I work on, they'll say, you know what? Let me ask you something. Tell me if this is racist. And then they start to tell me, so I'm like, hold up. I can tell you already, it's racist. It's almost certainly racist. Whatever you're about to say is racist. You don't have to tell me about that. I'm not your secret friend. Like, what? And so, yeah, I think that this, I'm totally with you.
I wanted to see if we can get some questions from the audience. Let me look at the Q&A here and see what's happening. Let's see, make sure. So, okay, we don't have any answered. Okay, aha.
Yay.
Here's one thing. Okay, from Diane Mack. What would sustained support look like to you for individuals, descendants of emancipated enslaved Africans and indigenous people outside of reparations?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that we have to remember, and that the Ajahnagar story tells us, is that it's going to have to be different for different communities and often down to different individuals. I've been doing some work with people who were trafficked in the United States. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing is we're trying to study the long-term outcomes. A lot of people know about the emergent needs of people who are escaping situations of exploitation on whatever broad range of exploitation you might be talking about. Even if you're talking about domestic violence or something, we know that people need we need to ensure that they have access to medical care immediately. They need to have housing. We know those emergent needs in some ways. We don't have a lot of research on like long-term needs, in particular for people who've been trafficked or people who've been enslaved or people who've been in forced labor. People don't spend a lot of time like doing longitudinal studies. And what I realized when I started just sort of beginning to try to study these long-term outcomes was that the things that most service providers believed people needed at the top of the list were not at all the things that the people I was talking to thought they needed, who were themselves survivors. Completely different. And that in fact, I talked to some service providers, and these were folks who were exiting commercial sexual, the commercial sex trade, most of whom had been forced to engage in the commercial sex trade. And this is different from slavery, but this is, and they had at the front of their mind, they wanted to be able to have healthy, engaged, intimate partnerships. And some of them were in service provider context in which they weren't allowed to date. But this was the number one goal they had. But their service providers believed that what would be best for them would to not be around men for a while. And I'm like, why do you get to decide this?
So in your view, they were trying to reclaim their power in terms of their own sexuality.
That's right. That's right. And not everybody did, but that was top of mind for some people. And I talked to some service providers who said things like, well, some people think that they're okay on housing when they're just sleeping on people's couches. And they're wrong. And I say, well, how are they wrong? If they think they're okay sleeping on somebody's couch and they're working on something else, maybe they're trying to get a job, maybe they're trying to get back with their children, maybe they're trying to, have an intimate partnership that was healthy and worked and was empowering for them. Why are they wrong that sleeping on their friend's couch is housing security for them? That is housing security for them. And so I think that we a lot of times think that there's a one size fits all practice. There's also, and we see this in the way we have been assessing human rights work. So you get these assessment models that say, have your clients met this goal and met this goal and met this goal and met this goal. And these are top down decided, usually from the West, imposed on, some big US organization that gets millions of dollars a year, impose it on some small community as if they know what they need. And it's shocking how wrong they almost always are. And the metrics that they're trying to use to prove that their money is doing good.
Right.
This is a mess. And so I don't think that there's a one size fits all answer. I think, having some kind of political ability to participate politically is typically essential. I think that having access to sort of basic needs being met, that's essential. But beyond that, I think it's super important that we look to each community and say, what is it that you need? What are the programs that you're doing that work well to help people be free? And how do we just send our money to let you do what you know how to do well and build your capacity? Right.
So it sounds like you're really talking about centering the voices of the people, right, who are really in need, and that is important. You're right. People often have a very top-down approach, and even the language of metrics, right? Is something that is it's a corporate model. It's part of the way that neoliberalism has impacted even right NGOs or political organizations. So that's very important. Okay, we have another question here.
Oh, good.
So when we look at the impact of, I think, redlining, right? Redlining, mass incarceration, disparities in healthcare, education, underemployment, child separations, foster care, housing insecurity, homelessness, underdevelopment of economic opportunities, voting rights, etc. Just taking it back to current day impact of enslavement. Okay, so that's one question.
Yeah, and it's I think you're sort of, we're in conversation now, Diane. I like it. I think that this is one of the more important things in the U.S. context, to constantly remember that the legacy of slavery is alive. It is felt in the inequality that it is experienced in the United States. I did a huge I interviewed 600 homeless youth about their experiences of work and how they were treated at work. And not only were they, exploited, had their wages stolen, often were forced to work or often unpaid, but they also had come to believe that that's all they were ever going to get. Right. And I remember that I grew up, my dad didn't go to high school. He was a fisherman for most of the time, but he also worked offshore. And he was constantly hurt at work, and there was no compensation for that. And he was always overworked. He was working more hours than he was supposed to. He got paid abysmally, obviously. And I believed as a young person that that's what work was. And I believed that I was never going to have a job that I loved. That was not I didn't think that that's how work worked. I believed that I would probably do backbreaking work, or work that would I didn't feel, met my goals in life, but that's how it was going to work. And I think that a lot of times this is not the legacy of slavery. This is the legacy of the way we constitute work and we deal with marginalized and poor people in the United States. And this still maintains, and it gets into people's minds. And it's not as bad for me, right? Because I'm white, and it was easy for me in many ways to escape, to sort of, my social mobility was eased by my whiteness. But for a lot of people, those, you don't have that privilege. And that is a reality that that I really get, because people can often not just, as with the people of Ajanunger, not just have that context that's holding them back, but be told there's nothing else. This is what's out there for you, and have that be a reality.
And it's really important to underline too that kind of common myth of meritocracy is still just so very powerful, and it really is a kind of collective investment or a fantasy that people buy into, that social mobility, you can come here and be anything that you want to, you can start anywhere and wind up on top, quote unquote, right? Hierarchy is something that's embedded in our understanding of life, but when we look at the actual reality of the situation, that's not what people are experiencing. It's not what people are experiencing here. It's not what people are experiencing, in the the context
all around the world.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that the answer to most of these questions, I'm going to contradict myself in some ways. The answer to the question of what do people need is often community-based and needs to be very locally understood. But there's also a much more broader systemic issue, which is that we need to address like radical inequality, like we were talking about, but with reparations, but also, just simply a living wage. The folks in Ajad Nagar needed to have access to water and a little bit of land and things that would allow them to prosper, quietly and on their own. Probably not ascend to any, political positions still, but we don't even give the US, not even in the US, do people have access to basic necessities on a daily basis. And we walk around every day as if that's not a big deal. And we keep trying to come up with solutions to big problems like human trafficking or modern slavery or forced labor, that have to do with band-aids, with like fixing the problem, rescuing people out, when in fact what we need to do is make sure people have enough food to eat and and enough a living wage and jobs that have dignity. That's what we need to be fighting for all the time.
I'm not sure about I'm mindful of our time here.
Yes.
So we can continue to talk. But I want to make sure, all right, Maria is here.
Yes, I am here. And let me see, I started my video. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, you're here.
Okay. Yes, so we have another half hour. So please do continue. I don't know, Laura, if you want to, since our program is really comparative and global, if you also wanted to make some comparisons to the US, but also to your new work in China, if you're prepared to do that.
Sure. So I think we've been doing a lot of this comparison to the U.S. And I think one of the main takeaways for the U.S. We've been talking about inequality and reparations and these kinds of things, but also that we need to stop discounting violent protests when it happens. We need to stop saying the word riot. We need to stop, like when people protest, we need to recognize that people have used a number of different. Let me make sure my battery's not going to die. Just a second. Okay, I think we're going to be good for a while. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm like out of at a conference, and so we also need to. So if I disappear, that's what happened, but I don't think that's going to happen. We need to recognize that when people are in the streets, it's almost always because they have exhausted every official channel that they've been told is theirs for the having. Like, just why don't you talk to your legislator? Why don't you talk to your social security office? Could you talk to this guy? Or why don't you go to school? Or why don't you do this? Why don't you just is my least favorite phrase in the world. Why don't you just, go get some schooling? Or why don't you just get a better job?
People who are talking basically who are not taking into account any context. Right? That's right.
Background. That's right. And so I think we need to recognize that that when people are in the streets, that they are out there making really rational claims that have built up, that have they've exhausted the channels that are supposedly opportunities for them to make their grievances. And I just want to really reinforce that. But when it comes to the newer work that I'm doing is kind of an extraordinary situation. I hope it is an extraordinary situation. So in the far west of China, there's a province called Xinjiang. It's largely inhabited by largely Muslim, Turkic-speaking people who are not Han. They're visibly and culturally different from the Han majority of the rest of the country. They're considered a minority. They're called a minority by the Han government, by the PRC government. Mm-hmm. But they're a majority in their in their home, in their hometowns. But China is colonizing this region. So since 1950s, but increasingly in the last 10 years, the Beijing government has sent Han people out to populate these cities and become the majority in the cities, have been incentivizing marriage to assimilate Uyghur women into Han families, have been putting children into orphanages to teach them only Chinese culture and language and separating them from their families, have been sterilizing the women to actually stop their reproduction, have been sending practically every man between the age of 18 and 45 was sent to internment camps in 2017. And I'm not exaggerating, like I'm being very serious. There's a system of internment camps that house about 1 million people. There are only 12 million minoritized citizens of that region. And since 2018, the Chinese government has sort of created a second wave of this repressive system that is that's characterized by forced labor. So they go to people's houses, they say, you are not adequately employed. So if you're a farmer, or if they don't like the job you're doing, or if you have seasonal labor, they'll say, we don't think you're adequately employed. They're considered surplus labor. And if you are deemed to be surplus labor, you must take a labor transfer. You may not say no. It is against the law to say no. And if you say no, you go to the internment camps because you're resisting a government order. And then they're sent to factories either close to home or sometimes very far away in the rest of China. And they produce the goods that we buy every day. They produce.
I was just about to say that with it. They're producing most of the things.
All of our goods.
Right.
Yeah. I've actually stopped buying things because I can't. And I don't know that that's the most effective, like a single consumer boycott is the most effective way to deal with this. But I personally, I lived in this region for a time. I know people who are in these camps. We have friends who have disappeared and we haven't heard from them in 4 years. And so for me, this is the only choice I can make because when I buy things, it's very clearly connected to the people I know. But even if you don't know people there, this is probably the most gruesome human rights abuse going on right now in the world. It certainly affects the most people in a sort of mass way. There's no one who is left unscathed in that region. And again, like when we go back to this question of what about the people who are in power? How does this affect their psychology? This is a situation that I think is going to be very difficult for Uyghur people and Han people for generations. This is going to have a legacy that no matter how it ends, and I don't know, I can't imagine what the end game is. No matter how it ends, it is going to radically affect the behaviors, lives, culture, but also psychology of all the people there. I don't, but like I actually sympathize. I worry about. I had Han friends in that place too, who were just citizens. They weren't, they don't get to decide government policy. And they've watched everyone they know disappear into internment camps and have been told, stay quiet, or you can be punished too. There have been some Han people who fought back, who've gone into prisons. So it's a kind of, it's just an extraordinary situation. It's extraordinary human rights crisis. And so while I was working on all of this and my work wasn't really going to be centered on China ever, that wasn't a situation that I was expecting. Because I work on forced labor, I have particular, knowledge of this field, and most people who worked in that region didn't. So I've been doing what I can to help do the work that needs to be done. And right now I'm actually at the conference I'm at is with UK lawmakers and civil servants to help them understand the crisis there and try to figure out what legislatively we can do to put pressure on China to stop doing this. Yeah. So
I think you're really pointing out something very important, Laura, and that's that we have different levels of scale, right? That people can think about in terms of analysis and intervention.
That's right. That's right.
That's important.
Yeah, and I think this is also where the questions of language comes up. Like, where's your line for what constitutes slavery historically or contemporarily? What is the line for right now? There's a big debate about where the line for genocide when we look at this situation, because these are folks who are being sterilized. Does that constitute genocide? By legal definition, it does. By sort of common definition, where people think of it as a mass murder kind of situation, it doesn't. And so one of the things, though, that I find myself, despite the fact that I do have a literature background and I'm very committed to language, I'm very interested in language and how language gets deployed in these situations. It's fascinating to be in the middle of this kind of a crisis and say, can we set that word or these words aside and say, these are the conditions of life for people there? How do we try to put pressure to ensure that those conditions will change? Whatever you want to call it. If you want to call it over here, you want to call it genocide. Over here, you don't want to call it genocide. Over here, you want to call it forced labor. Over here, you want to call it coercive labor. Can we get to the issue? Like, what can we do? Because in general, I would say we're waiting for, we're waiting for the lead from Uyghur people to step up, but Uyghur people can't leave. They can't escape. So we've got an exile community of Uyghur people who are fighting and leading the narrative and designing tactics and trying to figure out how we're going to address this issue, and we're following their lead. But in many ways, we can't even talk to the people who are most affected. So it's a matter of trying to figure out, how to put the most pressure to stop it.
So how do you partner with people on the ground, activists, and also scholars in China to shore up the kind of approach to this crisis?
This is a hard one because you've heard where I stand on how I understand responsible scholarship and responsible activism. I think that it needs to come from the people who are most affected. I need to be I think of myself as a follower and as a megaphone. I use my platforms because I have substantial platforms to get around and talk to people. And I use that to amplify the message of other folks. In this case, it's quite difficult. It is not safe to go to Xinjiang, and it's not safe for people in Xinjiang to talk to people from the outside. We've all been cut off. There have been people, academics, legislators alike, who've been sanctioned by the Chinese government and are not allowed to go back there, and all their assets has been seized and they've been deported. And it's intense. And so there's an attempt on the part of the government. And I think it's important to always emphasize it's the government, and it's not the people of China, it's the government of China. There's an attempt by the government to silence people, to put a chilling effect, to kind of slow people down from paying attention, and to really cut us off from information. And that makes it, and I talked to folks at Human Rights Watch a couple of weeks ago, this was actually a year and a half ago, where I said, okay, who are the people on the ground who we can be partnering with? And she said, they've all stopped communicating. It's just silence, radio silence, because it's so dangerous to reach out. So this is a hard call. There are a lot of people who are, experts in that region. And my co-author is Uyghur herself, the person I work with most closely on this research. Her cousin is in a camp. And so we work together with Uyghur people in exile, but there's no civil society organizations, nonprofits, or anything like that are allowed to exist in China to defend Uyghur rights. In fact, it is against the law to even talk about it.
So what's the kind of current strategy that you all are developing? You're working with an effort to try to put pressure with legislators to educate them, to put pressure on China. What other kinds of things can people be aware of and look out for?
Yeah. So I think that in this case, it's a strange thing for me, because I don't typically think of business or government as being the greatest arbiters of human rights. That's not who I usually collaborate with, honestly. I think that in this case, however, the claim that, Uyghur human rights need to be respected is not going to be respected by the Chinese government. They say, we're actually lifting everyone out of poverty by doing this. We're ending terrorism in the region. They're punishing pre-crimes of terrorism is what they're doing, and they're open about it. Again, this pre-crimes thing is something that we have to be careful about all around the world. They're
Right.
selling this, but it's
Prophylactic
also a thing that's happening in the
anti-terrorism,
US.
basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thought crimes. But look, this is happening in the US too. Let's not pretend.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, people are being punished for pre-crimes. They're being punished for being connected. So like, and there's technology in the United States to track who you're friends with on social media to say you're a pre-criminal because you're friends with or you're cousins with Bobby down the street and he's a criminal. But in the eyes of the state, not me, right? I don't call people criminals. And so this is happening on a mass scale in Xinjiang. They have cameras on every building and every angle. People are being watched all the time. All their data is collected and centrally stored and used against them. They're facially scanned every time they go to the grocery store. It is an intense police state. So there are a few things that I think people need to be doing. One, we have to use economic pressure. Human rights claims are not going to work in this situation. So what I'm doing is working on tracing supply chains and revealing companies that have their supply chains that go back to Xinjiang and forced labor, and then saying, what are you going to do to pull out of that? So we're trying to encourage business to do the right thing on this issue. And as a result, or to facilitate that, we're trying to get government to enact laws that hold companies accountable if they have forced labor in their supply chain. And the good news about this is that, if there's any good news, this is such an egregious human rights violation that people have suddenly woken up and said, okay, this is a step too far. It's horrifying to me that this is what it takes, like a massive state system of forced labor and internment, and in a country where a lot of countries have a reason to want to go after them, right? I think it's political as much as it is human rights issues. But putting that economic pressure, having the government say companies have to do it, will have a lasting effect, because it won't just be about this one region or about this one problem. It will be lasting forced labor legislation that will be applicable in other places and in other times. And that is something we desperately need. Our forced labor legislation is quite weak, actually. And in the US, it's stronger than in other places, which I find very surprising, but it turns out to be true. And so because China is exporting these systems of oppression, like as package deals to other authoritarian governments, we have to be very, very strong, I think, in our response to this, because if not, other authoritarian regimes will be like, all right, let's go for it. But if we really truly are able to stop this in China, I think a lot of other people will be deterred. A lot of other governments will be deterred. It's getting dark here.
Right.
Sorry.
You're at least 5-6 hours ahead, right? But I mean, the critical thing, just in terms of exposure is key. I mean, how do we bring things into light and make them visible? That's the only way we can have impact. But we know well, those who study the unconscious and psychoanalytic frames, that we have a whole slew of defenses to stop us, right, from dealing with the things that we don't want to deal with, right? That it's uncomfortable, so that we don't know what it is that we know, that we can have selective inattention, other kinds of things, and the work that you're describing really disrupts, potentially disrupts, those kinds of defenses that people have about what is literally happening in plain sight.
I spoke to 4, they're not CEOs, they were just sort of big managers of massive foreign or multinational corporations that operate in China. And I just, I raised my hand and said, like, directly, like, what investments does your company have in Xinjiang? And I knew the answer. I had Googled it first. I had checked on it. I had checked my notes, right? I came prepared, and they wiggled around it. And it's the UK, so people don't usually like interject and say, yeah, but in the US, I would have said, actually, you have an investment in this and you have an investment in this. But I didn't follow up, but they were visibly justifying for themselves their company's complicity in this massive human rights violation. And it's shocking. Like, the next day I sat across from one of those people who I know has an investment, and he couldn't look me in the eye. He was wiggling all through lunch. I mean, he's a grown man who has more money than I even know how to count, and is more security in the world. But this little lady made him totally afraid, because I know the thing that he is trying not to think. Right. And every time he sees me, it is a conscious reminder of that thing that he's repressing.
That's right.
And look, we can think about it on individual psychological level, but global capital obscures the means of production. It's constantly obscuring where labor goes and how labor is being treated. And so they intentionally obscure these supply chains, because if you look back at where things are mined, or where cotton comes from, or where your raw materials come from, you're likely to hit a spot where people are being wildly abused, where forced labor is endemic and everybody knows, where children are mining this stuff, right? And so no company wants to look into that. And the level of repression that these folks have to accept is hard. But I'll tell you, one person I know who worked, I didn't know before I started doing this research, but he read one of my reports, and he was doing work in an industry that I was reporting on, and he had contracts in China. And the man said he had to sit down with his wife and said, I can't do it anymore. If now that I know this, I can no longer work in this industry. He is the only person I've heard from who's had this happen. Nobody else is pulling out. They're all just saying, well, we have to operate in the laws of the country that we are in. So if that means massive systems of internment, well, I mean, it's not really on us.
But elevating those kinds of stories are important, because what it does is to remind people that we do have choices, and those choices do matter. And
that's right.
We can be class traders. We can have the realities that we are confronted with, informing what it is that we do from day to day, and the ways in which we're morally and ethically implicated, right?
That's right.
Suffering this world. So it's important. It's very
important. And I think we have to remind ourselves every day of how we're morally implicated in suffering. I like the way you put that. Yeah. And it's hard. It's hard every day. It is a hard thing, but that's partially why I do my work too, is that I think it's critical that with this great amount of privilege, that every single day I confront where that privilege comes from, and at the price of who's suffering. And so like that, so much of my work is driven by, so much of my work is just driven by rage. But like, I'm just a ball of rage. I'm not going to pretend. But a lot of it is driven by this sense that I have a responsibility for all of this, and since I can do this work, that's what I do.
I couldn't help but wonder what impact your years of work have had on you. And I mean, you're speaking to some of that now. I mean, as therapists, we're mindful of the impact of what we're hearing on us and how to deal with it, and it must be overwhelming for you.
Yeah, I will tell you, I have 6% of my battery left, so it's very possible I'm gonna blink out.
All right.
But I will say that it is difficult. And I think that one of the reasons also why I do this work is because I think that for a lot of people to sit and interview 600 homeless youth, there are a lot of people who don't have the sort of psychological barriers that would allow them to do that it would just permeate their every conscious and unconscious thought. And some part of me is empowered because I know that I can amplify their voices. I can influence government. I can influence homeless youth groups and help them hear the voices of the people they serve and prioritize their interests. So I feel empowered by that knowledge. But I also know that because I have this ability to not let it completely overwhelm me, that I have that's also a kind of responsibility, because not everybody can hear that. And I think therapists are probably similar, that therapists can often hear things that a lot of people, if they heard them, they would be wrecked. And so it's a very strange superpower. And sometimes I think that something's wrong with me, to be honest, that I'm not destroyed, by all that I know. But I try to think of it as a way of empowering and using, like I said, using myself as a vessel for empowerment for other folks. But it's uneasy.
Right. It's a lot of vicarious trauma to be exposed to, but it sounds like you're sublimating, what
yeah.
you're experiencing in that way. Yeah.
Before your battery runs out, one more thing I wanted to emphasize to the audience from your book about, once the people in India had their revolt and had some freedom, it was very difficult for them to believe that it was going to last, and that those feelings of oppression, continue on, even though there is freedom around them. And I thought that was also a very important message for us in the United States in terms of what people of color have suffered here, and marginalized people have suffered. And it just doesn't go away once the freedom is there.
Well, especially if the structures still remain. Exactly. Right. And the structures may change. They may have different names. They might be slightly institutionalized differently. Mm-hmm. But if the structures of inequality still remain, it's not just a psychological issue. It's a structural issue, right? That permeates psychological life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. We want to be mindful of your being in a different part of the world where it's night, and we know that you're moving forward. I want to make sure that your battery doesn't.
No, I'm fine. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that my battery would die like this. It's actually plugged into something, but apparently it's just eating right through the battery. But I'm still here.
Okay.
Well,
that final point is so critical because as we sit, in the U.S., Maria, to your point, people, feeling that whatever it is that they have is not going to last. We are you're still for the moment in a democracy, but the authoritarian. The authoritarian impulses, developments, and organizations, that are in place, impulses that are in place, should be giving everyone pause.
Yeah,
right. Should be giving everyone pause. I think that your work provides, Laura, an important reminder, right? That this is not something that we just have to think about, in other places. Like how do forces impact, right? And particularly since we are connected, globally in terms of the things that impact us, and the circulation of power. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you both for this very lively and informative discussion. I hope that it will have impact on us. From the beginning of this series, people have always asked, what can I do? Mm-hmm. What can we do? Wait, there is one more question before I do the finals here. So the question is about the systems that are in place and precisely how to make advances that are contingent. Oh, he said it was.
Yeah, the systems. Yeah, the systems are there to make this a reality. That's right. And how, I think your question was like, what can we do?
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of things. I think we need to be advocating for real changes at home and abroad. So, for instance, I often say that if you want to address, like a lot of people are interested in human trafficking in the United States, and they often think that what they are going to do to address that is, I don't know, build a homeless shelter. Not even a homeless shelter. They want to rescue girls. That's what everybody wants to do. They want to rescue the girls. But I say, couldn't we maybe prevent girls from being harmed, or boys from being harmed, or adult women and men?
Absolutely.
So what do we need to do that? Well, we need to be very cognizant of where our labor comes from and what we allow companies to do, and how, there are loopholes in our immigration schemes that really open up the possibility for massive exploitation. We don't have a living wage in the United States. This is this is outrageous. People live on almost nothing. So it's no surprise that they'll fall for a trick of somebody who's going to trick them into doing work against their will or for no pay or whatever horrible situation they might get put in. And internationally, it's the same thing. I think we think our only responsibility is to our own country, but in fact, there has to be investments around the world to ensure the well-being and livelihood of other people. I think we need to, like invest in development that is locally grown, locally cultivated and guided. I think that in the work that we do, we need to have people, if you're doing work on any particular issue, that work needs to be guided by survivors of that crisis or of that violation. White people don't need to be leading Black Lives Matter parades. They should be, or not parades, protests. They should be involved. We need to be allies, but being an ally means support and amplification, right? In terms of the India situation, that's a bit more difficult. There are changes going on in India that are extremely authoritarian and that are racist, casteist, and what's the word for anti-Islamic, that are extremely dangerous. We need to keep our eyes on that and be constantly working on addressing. You're welcome. Addressing Islamophobia and really like calling it out when we see it and being clear. In terms of the China thing, I think I want people to go out and read more about what's happening there. I think that we can put pressure on companies. We can, most of us have on Gap or, J. Jill, I don't know, some stores that are these fast fashion stores. These companies need to hear from consumers that they actually care where their raw materials come from, that we really do think it matters that they're engaging in these forced labor things, because they say that we don't care. They think we don't care, and that's what matters. So I mean, I think there's a lot of things we can do, but I hope that's kind of a start.
I know, Laura, that you have a train to catch, and we have approached.
This time is yours.
Well, we've approached the time boundary here for all of our guests as well, and I wanted to thank you both for this very informative, enlightening, and lively conversation. I hope we'll take what you've told us today and really do bring it to our lives, each and every one of us, to make some changes in the world. I would also like to invite our participants to return for the continuation of our series in 2022. Just to tell you a little bit, in February, we have Dr. Nahala Mashtag, who is a psychoanalyst and clinical psychologist in private practice in Tehran, Iran. She's one of the founding members of the director of the Ham Ava Institute in Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy in Iran. And she's been championing the cause of women in psychoanalysis through teaching, supervising, and mentoring young women therapists and helping them to find their unique voices while working within an anti-feminist social context. In March, we'll hear from Professor Stacy Leeds, who is a lawyer and a judge. She was the first woman to serve as the justice on the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court. She's currently a Muskogee Creek Nation District Court judge and an appellate court judge for the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. And she serves on many boards, including the American Indian Graduate Center and the American Indian Resource Center. And in April, we'll hear from Duncan Ryken Williams, and Professor Williams is professor of religion and East Asian languages and cultures and the director of the USC Shinzo Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture and the former chair of USC's School of Religion. And he will speak to us about the Japanese internment in the US. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I also wanted to mention that if you have friends who have missed this webinar today, that it's recorded and you will find it on the William Alanson White Institute's YouTube channel. So thank you for being with us today, and I hope everyone will stay safe and be well, and we hope to see you again. So thank you. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Nicole. That was a great conversation. It was so good.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
It would have spent Friday morning or afternoon in your case.
Yeah.
Evening.
Yeah, it's Friday night, I think. I think this is the weekend now.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah, y'all take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.